That trip into the Rockies was supposed to be just a break, nothing more than a weekend in August away from deadlines, noise, and endless traffic. And Ethan had been the one who suggested it because he swore that the thin mountain air and the smell of pine could reset your brain like nothing else. So he and his two buddies drove west out of Denver with a cooler full of beer, a tent borrowed from his cousin, and a playlist that mixed old rock with country sing-alongs. And the drive itself felt like part of the ritual. Winding roads that climbed higher until the city was gone and the only lights were the fading gold of the sunset on jagged peaks. And by the time they picked a spot near a shallow stream tucked between tall spruces, the air had cooled enough that the breath carried in faint clouds even in August. So they built a fire, cooked some burgers over the flames, and talked about everything from Ethan's job frustrations to Tyler's breakup to Mark's plans to finally propose. And the hours stretched into that quiet that only comes when you're miles from another human being. But it was in that stillness, when the conversation lulled and the only sounds were the crackling logs and the faint rush of the stream, that Ethan caught the first glimpse. A figure on the edge of the fire's glow, sitting very still beside the line of pines. Too far for the face to be clear, but close enough that the shape was unmistakable. A man, legs bent, arms loose, the posture almost casual, like someone waiting for an invitation. And Ethan thought maybe he was just seeing shadows, but when he blinked, the outline was still there, unmoving. And when he nudged Tyler and whispered, his friend's expression tightened because he saw it too. Then Mark turned his head and cursed under his breath, all three of them now aware that they weren't alone, though the man did nothing except sit there, a stillness that made their words dry up. And after long minutes, Ethan called out something stupid like, "Hey, you need help?" But no reply came, only the faint whistle of wind sliding down the slope. So eventually they told themselves it was probably another camper, someone resting, someone harmless. And they tried to push the thought away, though the figure didn't leave. And when they finally crawled into the tent, they zipped the flap tight and joked weakly about bears being less creepy than stalkers. But sleep came in fragments because every snap of a branch outside sounded deliberate, every silence cue heavy. And when dawn finally cut through the thin nylon walls, they rushed out, eager to confirm it had been nothing. But the man was gone, no trace at the fire pit edge where he had sat. No belongings, no pack, nothing. Except when Ethan walked a few steps toward the tree line, he froze because, just past the ashes, pressed into the damp earth were the clear prints of boots, heavy tread, pointing directly toward where their tent had stood, prints that stopped only a few feet short of the spot where they'd been sleeping. As if in the dark, someone had closed that distance and watched them up close, leaving them with the realization that whoever it was hadn't wandered away into the mountains. He had been close enough to touch the canvas, close enough to hear them breathe, and close enough to let them know that just because the mountains feel empty doesn't mean they are. If you thought being watched in the Rockies was unsettling, wait until you hear what happened when the world itself seemed to vanish around this next camper. I took my daughter camping in the Black Hills of South Dakota last summer, and I'll be honest with you, it wasn't just about the camping. It was about trying to reset after the divorce papers went through. Because I'd been married nearly 15 years, and suddenly I was waking up alone every morning. The house felt too big, the kitchen too quiet, and my daughter, who had just turned 15, barely spoke to me anymore, only half shrugging when I asked if she wanted pancakes or if she was okay. So when I suggested a camping trip, she surprised me by saying, "Yeah, sure." And I figured the Black Hills would be good because I'd gone once as a kid and remembered the smell of pine and the way the air cooled down even in July. So we loaded up my Subaru Outback with a cheap tent, sleeping bags, a little propane stove, some canned chili, and the cooler full of Gatorade, Dr. Pepper, and lunch meat. And we hit I-90 heading west from Sioux Falls, passing billboards for Wall Drug and the Giant Dinosaur Museum, laughing at some of the corny signs even though she tried to hide her smile. And by the time we reached the gravel entrance to the campground, it was pushing evening, the light falling in golden streaks through the pines, and the place was alive with the sound of kids running, someone playing country music on a portable speaker, the smell of hot dogs roasting over a fire, and for the first time in months, I felt something like peace, like maybe we were stepping into a normal night, just a mom and daughter in a place far from lawyers and shouting and slammed doors. So we pitched the tent between two bigger family sites. One had a Ford F-150 with a camper shell,
The other a big RV with those string lights hanging from the awning, and people nodded politely when we passed carrying our cooler. A dad even offered me an extra chair, and my daughter actually took out her phone less and sat by the fire with me, poking the embers with a stick while we roasted marshmallows. And later, as the night went on, I listened to the crackle of different campfires, a couple of teenagers playing guitar, some laughter from across the lot, and when we finally zipped up our tent around midnight, the last thing I heard before drifting off was the soft rustle of wind in the trees mixed with those campground sounds that made you feel safe, like the world was still turning okay. But sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I shot awake, not sure why. Maybe it was the silence, because it was dead silent, like every sound had been sucked away. No wind, no fire crackling, no shifting bodies in nearby tents, and I lay there, listening, and realized there weren't even crickets or owls or anything, just nothing. And when I unzipped the tent and stepped out barefoot into the dirt, it was like walking into a photograph. The fires that had been glowing were dark piles of ash, the RV lights were off, and every single tent flap around us was wide open with nobody inside, just bags and coolers sitting there like they'd been abandoned mid-use. And my stomach dropped because it didn't look like everyone had left. It looked like they'd simply stopped existing. My daughter stirred behind me asking what I was doing, and I told her to stay put, but I couldn't help walking between the empty sites, looking at the chairs pulled up around dead fires, half-finished soda cans, a cooler lid still open with melted ice dripping, and I kept waiting for someone to jump out laughing, but there was no one, not even the hum of a generator from the RV, and the silence pressed so hard it felt like a weight on my chest. I went back to the tent shaking and held my daughter close, pretending it was fine, just a bad dream. But I couldn't sleep. I watched the nylon walls glow faintly from a moon that didn't seem to move. And when the first light of morning broke through, I sat up expecting the nightmare to continue, but what I saw made me question if I'd lost my mind, because the campground was alive again. The same dad in the Ford was pouring coffee from a thermos. Kids were laughing as they ran to the outhouse. Smoke curled from campfires where breakfast bacon sizzled. And nobody looked at me like anything strange had happened. They smiled like they had the night before, like nothing had vanished. And my daughter walked out of the tent squinting at the sun, asking if we had pop carts. No memory of what I'd seen. And I stood there staring at those people cooking and laughing and talking, trying to convince myself maybe I'd had dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I was so tired from stress that my brain shut down. But then I noticed something small that made the hairs rise on my arms. On the picnic table by our tent was a soda can, Dr. Pepper, still open and warm. And I remembered clear as day that I had set it down next to the fire ring in the middle of the silence when everyone was gone, when the world felt paused. And there it was, in daylight, like proof that for a few hours in the Black Hills, the world had slipped into something else, and nobody but me seemed to know it. That silence in the Black Hills was just the beginning. The next story will drag you into a night so quiet you'll swear the forest itself is holding its breath.
I still remember the way the late August air felt heavy when we decided to spend a night out by Lake Tenkiller in Oklahoma, a place most folks around here know for being calm and quiet with long stretches of dark water framed by woods that seem to stretch on forever. And my buddy Greg and his wife Rachel had asked if I wanted to come along for the weekend, but I turned them down, telling them I had work, though later I wished I had gone, if only to know firsthand what they saw, because the story they told afterward never left me. They said they wanted to celebrate their 3rd wedding anniversary away from traffic, phones, and all the noise of Tulsa life, so they packed up a small tent, a cooler, and some fishing poles, and drove out there just as the sun was dropping. They told me the lake was glassy, catching streaks of fading orange light, and the campground was practically empty aside from one other RV parked further down the tree line, the kind of stillness that makes every branch crack seem louder than it should. They built a small fire with the kind of dry wood that pops and spits and cooked a couple hot dogs. Rachel had a bottle of wine, Greg had a 6-pack, and they laughed about how it felt like dating again instead of being weighed down by bills and routines. They said the night carried that mix of cicada drone and faraway splash from the lake that makes Oklahoma nights both alive and strangely isolating.
Around 10, Rachel swore she heard something faint from the tree line, a dragging metallic sound. But Greg told her it was probably just the RV guy dragging a cooler, or maybe someone carrying gear. Though when the sound came again, it was more distinct, like a chain being pulled slowly over dirt and rocks. They let it go until curiosity pushed them to stand up with their flashlights and step into the edge of the woods. That's when their lights caught on the eyes of a dog. Not a stray, but a medium-sized mutt with a rust-colored coat, and it was tied with an old iron chain to a tree. The chain links caked in dark flakes that looked too much like dried blood to be rust. Rachel said the smell hit her before she even got close, a coppery, wet odor mixed with decay. Greg crouched, but the dog didn't growl or bark. It just stared and pulled back, whining faintly. And when his flashlight beam dropped to the ground, he swore the dirt was dark and sticky like it had been soaked. He tugged Rachel's arm and said they needed to get back to their camp. But as they backed away, the dragging chain sound came again, this time from behind them, though the dog hadn't moved. They spun their lights in every direction, but nothing was there, only the trees breathing in the windless night. Back at their fire, Rachel asked if they should leave, but Greg, trying to play it down, said they'd be fine, though he admitted later he didn't believe his own words. Around midnight, they crawled into the tent and lay listening. The cicadas had gone silent, which made every tiny sound sharper. At one point, Rachel whispered that she could hear the chain again. Slow, steady, circling outside the nylon walls of their tent. Greg grabbed the small hatchet they'd used for kindling and held it tight, heart thudding, but he couldn't bring himself to unzip the tent and look. He said the sound stopped for a long while, then returned, this time closer to Rachel's side, scraping like metal dragged across gravel, until suddenly it stopped with a clink. Rachel said she didn't sleep at all, staring at the dark fabric ceiling, waiting, listening. Greg must have dozed off because he woke to the sound of water splashing like someone waiting, and when he peeked through the zipper, he swore he saw the chain lying stretched across the dirt just feet from the tent flap. But no one was holding it. No dog, no person, nothing. He shut the flap again and sat there with his hand locked on the hatchet until dawn. When the sun finally burned through the trees and the birds started making noise again, he stepped out with Rachel, shaken, and saw no chain, no dog, no marks on the ground where they had stood the night before. The tree where they swore the mutt had been tied was bare, no scarring on the bark, no disturbed earth, just quiet morning air and lake water glinting like nothing had happened. They packed fast and drove out, neither speaking until they hit the main road. And when they stopped later for gas near Cookson, they asked the old man at the counter if he knew anything about dogs chained in the woods near the lake. The man frowned, leaned on the counter, and said folks used to talk about a man who dumped dogs out there back in the 70s, chained them to trees and left them, sometimes worse. And he disappeared not long after, maybe drowned in the lake, maybe caught by someone. Nobody really knew. But every now and then, campers still claimed to hear the chains at night. Some swore they saw the animals, others said they heard the dragging, but never found a thing. Greg told me all this with that kind of look you don't fake, pale, shaken, not sure if he believed it himself. And Rachel, who's usually stubborn as hell, wouldn't say much except she'd never camp near that lake again. And the funny part was, when I finally went out there myself a few weeks later, just to clear my head, I didn't see or hear anything. But I did notice how damn quiet those woods get after dark, like the whole place is holding its breath. And sometimes when I sit alone, I swear I can still imagine that slow metallic drag moving just out of sight, waiting for someone to follow it deeper into the trees. They thought a chained dog was the worst of it, but in the Florida Keys, things crawl in numbers that will make your skin crawl.
I had been moving south along the narrow spine of the Florida Keys that summer, sleeping out where I could to save money and breathe away from people. And when I saw the broken sign for an old quarry off the side of the overseas highway just past Big Pine, I figured it would be as good a place as any to throw up a tent. The gravel drive was half washed away and lined with weeds, but I got my van in far enough, killed the engine, and carried my gear up onto a patch of limestone ground overlooking a pool of stagnant water that had collected in the quarry pit. The place was empty, no birds, no frogs, just that heavy late August air that stuck to your skin. And after I cooked a small dinner on my camp stove, I set up my tent and tried to settle in for the night. But the stillness was wrong. The kind of silence where you start waiting for something to break it. And a little after midnight, I got it. A faint scratching at first, like dry claws moving over rock, then a squeal, then another. And before I could unzip the tent and look, there were shadows darting across the mesh. Dozens of them, their shapes sharp under the dim moonlight. I slapped at the wall of the tent thinking it would scare them off, but it only seemed to excite them. The sound grew thicker, skittering on all sides, until I realized they were climbing up the fabric itself, tiny claws pricking through as they moved, tails whipping against the nylon. And then one bold thing pressed its nose against the screen by my face, and I saw its wet black eyes and yellow teeth no more than inches away. I shouted and waved my lantern, and the whole side of the tent rippled as they scattered, but they didn't go far. I could hear them circling in the gravel, squeaking, gnawing, a rolling sea of noise that didn't let up. I built a quick fire outside with the driest branches I could find and sat there the rest of the night, tossing in more wood whenever the flames dipped, watching the ring of glowing eyes blinking in the dark just outside the reach of the light. Too many of them to count. The smell of them strong and musky, like a barn gone sour. I didn't sleep, only waited for the sky to brighten, and when morning came, the quarry looked normal again, silent except for a few lazy buzzards overhead, the ground showing only faint tracks, and I told myself maybe I'd dreamed it out of exhaustion. So I stayed, cooked some coffee, and forced myself to relax through the day. But when night came again and the heat settled down over the water, the sound returned almost immediately, louder, like they'd been waiting for the sun to set. Scratching multiplied by 10, claws on stone, bodies sliding through brush. Then the first wave came across the campsite in a solid moving sheet, hundreds of rats, fat, thin, young, old, all sizes, climbing over each other and heading straight for the tent. I'd barely got inside before they swarmed the walls, shaking the fabric so hard I thought it would collapse. Their teeth rasping on the zippers and poles, the air hot and suffocating with the stench of them. I tried banging pots together, blasting my flashlight, even firing up the camp stove to throw light and heat. Nothing worked. The rodents only grew more frenzied, and I felt this awful pressure in my chest, like their sheer numbers were sucking the oxygen out of the space. Every breath thin and ragged, my head spinning while the scratching went on without end. I stumbled out clutching a burning branch from the fire and swung it in wide arcs, sparks flying, the horde splitting and rejoining as if choreographed, their squeals piercing. And it was in that moment that I knew I couldn't last another night. I wouldn't be able to fight them off again without going insane. So as the first light of dawn cracked pale over the quarry, I shoved my tent half-packed into the van, slammed the doors, and drove back out to the highway with my windows down to vent the smell of smoke and sweat, watching in the rear view as the entrance to that place shrank into the morning haze. And though I kept going all the way down to Key West, I couldn't shake the sense of crawling movement under my skin, as if some of those creatures had hitched a ride without me seeing, hiding in the seams of my gear or in the dark corners of the van. And even now, when I try to sleep, I sometimes hear that scratching start up again, faint at first, and then louder, just waiting for me to close my eyes. After surviving a night of relentless gnawing and scratching, the terror of being alone in the open can take a new shape, and in Texas, it waits in the very ground beneath you.
I had always loved hiking. It was my way of clearing my head, especially after long weeks of office work where the walls felt like they were closing in on me. So when August rolled around and the air in Texas was heavy with heat and dust, I decided to take a solo trip out to Palo Duro Canyon, a place I'd visited a few times with friends, but never alone. And there was something about being out there by myself that felt like a test of character. Just me, the red rock walls, and the wide open sky. And that morning I set off early with a light pack, water, and a few snacks, telling my wife I'd be back before sundown. The air was still and the trails mostly empty, cicadas buzzing somewhere high in the scrub trees, and I remember the crunch of gravel under my boots as I worked my way deeper into the canyon where the walls rose higher and the shadows grew sharper. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel both calm and watched at the same time, like the land itself is paying attention to every step you take.
I'd walked a good 2 hours when the ground suddenly shifted under me. Not like a loose stone, but like the earth itself gave out. One second I was upright and steady, the next I was dropping straight down into darkness with a roar of crumbling dirt around my ears. I landed hard in a narrow chute, my shoulder slamming rock, dust choking my mouth, my pack twisted up under me. It knocked the air out of my lungs, and for a moment I just lay there stunned, trying to remember which way was up. When I got my bearings, I realized I was wedged into what felt like a crack in the canyon floor, no wider than my body in some spots, jagged stone pressing into my ribs and hips. I could look up and see a slice of blue sky maybe 20 feet above, dust motes drifting in the sunbeam. But climbing out wasn't simple, because every attempt to push up sent more soil crumbling onto my face. The chute walls were smooth in places, slick with packed clay, and every handhold crumbled the second I put weight on it. My legs were twisted at an awkward angle, and I could feel the sharp point of rock digging into my shin. It was one of those moments where panic doesn't come all at once, it creeps in slow. First, the realization that nobody knew exactly where I was on the trail, then the fact that my phone, when I fumbled for it, had no service. Then the oppressive silence pressing in except for the faint hiss of shifting dirt as the canyon adjusted to my weight. I tried to keep calm, tried to think of what they always say about accidents, that you're supposed to conserve energy, breathe evenly, assess the situation. But the air down there was stifling and each breath felt hot and gritty. So I forced myself to test the walls, to push my back against one side and brace my boots against the other, inching upward a few inches at a time. But halfway up, my boot slipped and I dropped back into the same cramped space with a crack that sent pain shooting through my ankle. I cursed out loud, my voice sounding strange, muffled and swallowed by the earth, like the canyon didn't want echoes. It wanted to keep everything it caught. I tried again, slower this time, shifting my weight carefully, finding tiny protrusions where stone jutted out just enough for me to hook a boot. The whole time, dust was falling into my eyes and throat, and I had this overwhelming sense of the walls closing in tighter, like the earth itself wanted me there, wanted me trapped. I lost track of time, whether it was minutes or hours, because all I could do was focus on moving one limb at a time, on pushing with my legs until the muscles burned, on ignoring the way my chest barely had room to expand with each breath. At one point I froze, because I swore I heard something in the dirt below me, a shifting that wasn't me, like the scrape of stone on stone or something dragging slowly through the narrow gap. I tried to convince myself it was just loose rock settling, but I couldn't shake the image of something alive down there in the dark, waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to fall back into its reach. So I forced myself upward again, digging nails into the packed clay, tasting blood from where I bit my lip, my arms shaking so badly I thought they'd give out. And finally, after what felt like forever, my hand broke through loose soil into sunlight and air. I clawed at the ground until I dragged myself out onto the canyon floor, gasping, covered in dust, my pack torn and my clothes streaked with red clay. I just lay there for a long time, staring up at the endless blue sky, listening to the silence of the canyon like it had never been disturbed. When I finally got the strength to stand, I didn't even care which trail I was on. I just walked, limping, until I found the parking area and collapsed against my car. It took days for the bruises to fade and weeks for my ankle to heal, but the memory never left me. Not the fall, not the suffocating press of the earth, but the feeling that something down there in the rock had noticed me, like the canyon itself had opened up just to take a look, and for a moment I wasn't sure if it would ever let me go.